We're ready. Good afternoon. I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. And I'm the moderator of a session which will enable us to hear Catherine Mann. For those who don't know Catherine Mann, she's the chief economist at the OECD, and she is an all-star professional, a professor of economics at Brandeis, a board member of the Global Interdependence Center, a personal friend of, I don't want us to reveal how many years now Catherine has been that long, and she's even a fairly decent fisher lady. I've witnessed that myself. And so her bio is in the program, and my only job is to present Catherine Mann, who will then give us a message which will be very important in the times we're in. Kathy.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And yes, you know, it has been a long time since, you know, I've been working with GIC, and it's really been able to sort of watch the organization grow and mature and expand its membership and really play I think a really important role in this communication between policy and academia and business. This is the turf that really needs to be well trod and well developed if we're going to actually have an environment where economic performance is improved and widely shared. So last Wednesday was when the OECD delivered its most recent interim economic outlook. So I thought I would use that as my framework for talking about issues in terms of the global economy today. So you can tell from the title, Tailwinds Driving a Modest Acceleration but Storm Clouds on the Horizon. Well, that pretty much gives you kind of where we're going to go. I won't go through the entire thing because it's a little bit too long, but give you the messages up front because that's always a useful thing to do. The OECD has, in contrast to the IMF and the World Bank and the Commission, we've actually taken up our forecast for the global economy, our projections for 2015 and 2016. This is in large part because of calendar effects, so to speak, and that is our data window for the change in the forecast extended longer in time than the IMF and the World Banks. We were able to see the improved data coming in on in terms of GDP growth for Germany, the UK, and the US and Japan in Q4. And we've in being able to incorporate that. Secondly, the oil price being low for longer, we were able to incorporate that into our projections, and also the implications of by the ECB and associated changes in asset markets. Those are also incorporated in our projections. Even so, though, even with all of this, if you just compare the countries that are in our sample and the countries that are on the IMF's, even then, we are more positive. On the other hand, we do see some significant problems in terms of an inconsistency between the real economy and the financial signals, and we think that that's going to be generating some problems. When I say abnormally low inflation and low interest rates, I think you all in this room know exactly what I'm talking about. We also have had these rather significant changes in exchange rates and in other asset prices, particularly equities. And that is in contrast or in opposition to what's going on in terms of the real economy, in terms of investment and employment. So on the one hand, some of these financial signals really are showing very significant strength, asset prices in particular, but in terms of its translation into real economic performance, not so much. And so that implies that there are a variety of areas where we have significant amounts of mispricing of risks in the financial markets, and we know that those things don't end well. So in terms of policy, which is one thing that we do focus a lot on at the OECD, we're talking a lot about balanced policy packages that in order to have this translation from the sort of the impetus coming from monetary policy transmitted more completely through the real economy, we need to really see more being done on the fiscal side, and we need to see reinvigorated structural effort because it's the synergies between those three elements of the policy package, the two on the demand side and one on the structural side, the synergies between those that really are going to, we hope, power the global economy to a slightly better performance over the next 2 years. So this is just our projections. We have just a tick up the little greens relative to where we were in November, which was the last time we did a full-blown forecast. It's a couple of tenths of a percentage point, so it is better, but it's not exactly something to go out and cheer about. In part, well, we all know that, in terms of the oil price, that's one piece of it. In terms of our projections, last in November, we had $85 a barrel, and this time we're using 57. So if we translate that into impact on GDP, the level of GDP for various countries, in grouping, you can see net exporters net oil exporters in the blue bars. All of them are in bad shape, but different ways of combining that in terms of net importers, OECD, not OECD. And this group that we pay a lot of attention to now at the OECD is the G20. We do a lot of work with the G20, and the G20 would gain about $300 billion on arithmetic alone coming through the trade balance, and that represents about a half a percentage point of GDP. This is a diagram of central bank easing around the world that has received some, I've seen it on Twitter a bunch of times. And it gives you an idea of just how significant the central bank easing has been above and beyond what the ECB did. And it also gives you an idea of how many times a number of countries have eased since December 2014, and what the proportion of the global economy is that is now in an environment of relatively eased monetary policy. That is the instrument of choice right now for policymakers. And on the one hand, we can say it's a good thing to have more monetary ease. On the other hand, there are a number of countries here who eased, even though their inflation rates are above their target zone, India, for example. And then there are other central banks that eased not so much because of the rate of growth of their domestic economy, but because of concerns vis-a-vis international capital flows. So monetary policy ease was being more of a prophylactic to avoid exchange rate appreciation. So we do see that the ECB's actions are operating on the euro area. Back in November, we basically were looking at the euro area as a major drag on global growth. It was the very poor performance of the euro area economies that were basically dragging down the overall global economy. So since then, ECB action has been more aggressive, coming down of the yield curve of basically 200 basis points in a year. And at the long end, now we're at the 1% on average. The other channel of transmission, of course, is the exchange rate. I'm sure we had some discussion about that earlier. The initial announcement and then subsequent further depreciation in the sense of potentially timing in the Federal Reserve increase in interest rates, trying to take advantage of that earlier on, but also probabilistically an overshoot. So I'm not going to show you this because it's too detailed, but it basically gives you the sense in which we've had this increase of a couple tenths of a percentage points of the global economy. Now, as I said, why should we not yet be cheering about this? It's because the employment situation, which of course is another measure of economic performance, really has not yet improved much at all. A couple different ways of measuring that. It's standard to be looking at the unemployment rate, that is the yellow line. And that looks pretty good. Nice decline in the unemployment rate for the G7 economies since the peak when the financial crisis was at its worst. On the other hand, if we look at the green line, which is the employment rate for the G7, a little bit of a tick up recently, but basically pretty sad, pretty sick. Not much of an improvement at all since the nadir in the depths of the financial crisis. So in terms of the employment situation, which of course is the going to be generating the demand that would trigger the signals for business to invest in CapEx, for example, we really don't see that yet. Now you could say, well, people aren't being employed, but they're earning a lot more money. P times Q. Answer is no, not so much. So another measure of economic performance in the labor market, of course, is wages. And as you can see, from the 2000s up to the point of the financial crisis, real wage growth in blue and labor productivity growth in red didn't track perfectly, but were relatively close together. Whereas since the financial crisis ended, or as the recovery began, starting in 2010, we have very little employment growth, very little real wage growth in comparison to the robust labor productivity growth. Now, most people know this as the rising profit share and the shrinking wage share of GDP, but it does again point to the extent to which the labor market has not yet been repaired, and until the labor market is better repaired and we see more wage growth as well as more employment growth, we are not going to get the signals to support a sustained demand condition. So we could go through a bunch of different parts of these economies, but I'd like to do this quickly, in part because I'm sure you're familiar with most of these issues. But looking at the charts, the oil price effect on the U.S. economy is much stronger than it is on other parts of the world. And that is because the depreciation or the decline in the value of oil prices is greater for the U.S., the distribution margins are more competitive, and the marginal propensity to consume out of the lower half of the distribution, which is getting the big improvement of oil products in their pocketbook, is 100%. So that represents, or it adds up to about $80 a month more in potential spending coming from for the consumer in the United States. So that's a really big deal. And maybe it didn't show up so much in the Northeast in the winter quarter, the first quarter, so that's not going to look good. But on the other hand, it's definitely in the pocketbook and they're ready to spend. Our fiscal policy is on neutral, as you see, absent brinksmanship, which I think we get to look at again later in the year. Federal Reserve, we actually have it in the projections increasing in June, but as we go to our next outlook, which is in June, we'll be pushing that out further on the grounds that inflation still remains below target, and the unemployment rate, although being low, the employment rate and wages still have not recovered. So the last point there, domestic demand growing faster than output, that's an important point because it's once again the U.S. economy is coming to the rescue of the global economy by running a larger current account deficit. Now, in various other fora where we talk about these things, a number of occasions where in these other groups they sort of say, we have to rectify global imbalances. And my response is, you can't say that and expect the global economy to grow on the back of the United States. So, the same person who sort of wants the U.S. economy to grow and to be the importer of last resort cannot also turn around and say, but now I'm worried about external imbalances. So here's a number of measures of what's going on in the euro area. And as I say, we've got a lot of monetary ease. We've got oil price declines. We've got a euro depreciation. In some sense, if we can't get euro area off the ground with this set of policies, then I wonder about whether the bird can ever fly at all. But we are seeing positive retail trade. We're seeing positive PMI. We do see the declines in the mortgage rates, which were an important outcome of the ECB, its actions, and the bringing down of the longer-term rates. And we're seeing the equity channel as well work. Now, all of these channels of transmission, the equity, the credit channel, and the euro channel, these are all channels that were important for the U.S. economy as well. Now, I would argue that all of them are more tempered in terms of their effectiveness in the euro environment, and we can talk about why that might be. But as I say, they are the as good as we are going to get right now coming out of the euro area, at least until we get some potential changes in the way in which the ECB operates directly in the credit markets, which is a possibility. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the second instrument that's in the euro area, and that is fiscal policy. So we do a lot of work on the various fiscal efforts in Europe, and we're talking more these days about the importance of a stable medium-term fiscal path. And as you can see in the chart, euro area after the initial fiscal deficit in the blue bar and the automatic stabilizers working, then turned to a increasingly tight fiscal environment in the yellow and then the red. Now, it's true that right now we're going to a close to neutral stance in green, but those two times, those periods of red and yellow, part of the reason for the fiscal tightness there was because of the rules of the fiscal game here in Europe. And the tightness of those rules, and in some sense the overdetermined nature of the rules that are set in the context of the Commission's grading of economies, can lead to a situation where governments make poor policy choices in order to achieve their targets. We know that certain types of fiscal cutting is better for growth, or least damaging to growth, rather than others. And in the effort to achieve certain targets, meet certain rules within the Commission, guidelines, the Stability and Growth Pact, it's clear that some governments did not choose the best instruments. It's also true that they tended to try to achieve whichever target they could, gaming the system. So in response to that, what we've seen the Commission end up doing is invoking sort of the ad hoc, well, you don't have to quite meet this deadline right now. So since 2009, there have been 20 such ad hoc extensions of achieving certain of the objectives. Now you might say, okay, good, they got more time, but since it's ad hoc, governments actually can't create and then follow a stable medium-term fiscal path, because there's always this question of which deadline are they going to get an extension of next time. So the sum total of choosing the wrong ways to meet the target, or getting a deadline but in an ad hoc way, and as I say, the overdetermined nature of the multiple objectives that have to be met, the collective of that tends to reduce the fiscal multipliers on any expansion that a government does try to undertake. So it means that the fiscal instrument doesn't get deployed well, and even when it's deployed, has limited impact. So in thinking about an effective use of the fiscal instrument, focusing on the medium-term path is one that we think is increasingly needed within the euro area. So I think you probably heard a little bit about Juncker this morning. So the vocabulary that I use on this is that the Juncker plan offers a rallying point for governments in Europe. It is demand for the governments who want to talk about demand, and it is supply for those governments who believe that the problems in Europe stem from supply constraints. So investment is both. And so in searching for a common rallying point for government policy, of which there probably is not any right now, finding one where governments can agree on a strategy is an important part of rebuilding business confidence, which is one reason for why we see such slack investment. We also have a number of parts of our research program that focuses on the role of public investment and the potential multipliers that come from public investment. And what we found is that collective action on the part of governments, which is a component of the Juncker plan, the collective action nature of it enhances the fiscal multipliers, the public investment multipliers. Further, the particular targets for the Juncker plan, which is to focus on the network industries, and in particular to address the regulatory divergence in network industries. As you can see, electricity prices in the top panel give you an idea about how divergent the prices are, in part because of regulatory differences across members of the euro area, that if there was just harmonization, not complete, but just 20% of the divergence in regulatory environment in the network industries would potentially increase FDI within the European Union more broadly, not just the euro area, would increase FDI. And of course, what we're talking about there is Portugal into Spain, and Spain into France, and France into Germany. So FDI is not about the Chinese here. It's about within the euro union itself. Increase cross-border investment by about 25% and increase trade intensity by 15%. So regulatory harmonization, key component of Juncker, can play a very important role in driving this return to a more positive investment climate and more positive investment reaction, which is a key to getting employment back on track and creating a sustainable environment for growth. I don't know how much you talked about Japan. The two figures, I think, are the most important thing to look at in this chart. They both are long-term trends. Long-term downward trend on labor productivity growth and upward trend on debt to GDP, and basically no change in deficit. It is going to be virtually impossible for Japan to service their debt under any scenario, but certainly under any scenario that does not see an immediate and a sustained upturn in labor productivity growth. This is why the third arrow continues to be basically the only arrow that matters at this point. It's nice to have the fiscal spending, a little extra boost right now, QQE, little boost right now, but in the absence of the structural arrow really being used, neither one of those other two are going to have much impact for Japan's sustainable growth. China, China is a political number. It's declining to about 7%. But the challenge for China really is this rebalancing issue. They are experiencing lower growth. They have not yet been able to make the transition to domestic demand-led growth, as you can see in the bottom panel, which is consumption as a share of GDP. And so the tension that they face right now is, do we do more of the same thing that we have always done in order to boost demand, which is credit extended to the state-owned sectors, which is depreciation of the RMB? Do we do this even though we know it raises vulnerabilities in the economy and takes us further away from the path we say that we want, which is domestic demand-led growth? On India, as I say, we engage quite a bit with the outside the OECD membership, traditional OECD membership through the G20, so we spend a lot of time focusing on some of these other economies. And the problem here with India is, of course, that they changed their accounting in a good way in order to meet current standards of the system of national accounts. So the adjustment is a very good adjustment in terms of bringing India online with the same kinds of data, comparable data than other countries, but it does make it very hard to judge what's going to be happening with India going forward. They are very happy that they are the leader of the growth pack, but whether or not that's sustainable is a question, and we believe that they probably are going to be slowing down because neither exports in the blue line nor investment in the green line are particularly strong right now. And until that can turn around, we don't see much of we see a deceleration for India, not an acceleration. So I want to move to the storm clouds, since I just want to spend 5 or 7 minutes on that. So first, deflation. The red chart on the left is the number of countries that currently have had year-over-year negative inflation rate. So it's up to about 23 now. So that's actually a fairly sizable number of economies that are currently in a deflationary. Is it persistent deflation? Well, year over year for year starts to make it look a little bit persistent. We've also seen convergence, which is in the right panel, basically down to 0. Now, we're not calling for deflation yet as being a significant problem or that it's a global problem, but it does imply some problems with repayment and vulnerabilities for households, firms, and governments, all of whom still have some balance sheet repair to do. Now, the next set of issues that we have in terms of storm clouds are all related to mispricing of risk. Negative term premium. Nominal interest rates are very low and in many cases negative. So we've got a 3-year government bond yield on the right. A lot of those are in negative territory and rather significantly negative territory. On the left, what you're seeing is how much the 10-year bond yield has come down from the average in the 80s and 90s and 2000s to where it is today. So across the board, dramatic compression of the term premium. Now, some of that is warranted in terms of the overall inflation convergence, but 10-year money at this price is a deal that you want to take if you're a borrower, but if you're a lender, you've got to be crazy. And now we can measure risk premia in a couple of other ways as well. MSCI World Equity Index, all-time high, DAX up 70% in the last year. Equity near its peak, almost its peak in the U.S. So, given what we've just seen about the state of the global economy as being a little bit better, but not so much better, these equity premia cannot possibly be reflective of true underlying economic fundamentals. Another measure of credit compression, credit risk compression, is credit default swaps being at a very low rate compared to the 2005 to present average. And then on the bottom panel, a little bit of a tick up in foreign exchange volatility measures, but dramatically lower than they were during the taper tantrum, which we would expect to see again. Whenever the Fed raises the interest rate by 25 basis points, there will be a tantrum, because even though the Fed has said over and over again, data dependency, going to do it, so forth, when it happens, there's going to be a lot of repositioning. So just to conclude, we do think that the global economy is at a turning point. We think that with all of this central bank ease, with a more neutral fiscal path for the United States, we hope for a somewhat more expansionary fiscal path in Europe on the back of the Juncker plan, and the lower energy prices, that this all adds up to a turning point for global growth. We don't yet say that it's a turning point into a nice V-shaped recovery, because unless we see real investment take off, we cannot say that we've got a stable and projecting forward accelerating global economy. We're focusing a lot on these mutually supportive fiscal, monetary, and structural policies. Didn't talk too much about structural policies, but the one point that I think I would like to bring to the table at this juncture is to say that there are a lot of economies that have slowed down their structural reforms. Some of that might be to take a breather, but some of the research that we have shows that if you get to a certain point with regard to structural reforms and you don't keep on implementing them further and more widespread and more completely, then the risks are that the reforms unravel. so that there is a sense in which it's a turning point for structural policy as well. We have to get demand growing faster so as to support a renewed effort on structural policies. Those structural policies are what are a key component of getting the investment climate positive enough so that we can have this underpinning, this moving to a virtual cycle of higher investment, higher employment, higher wages, higher consumption, higher growth, higher investment. So we are concerned at that last point about the over-reliance on monetary policy. We have to have these other two items going on together, these collection of policies working together in order to have a more sustained and complete recovery of the global economy. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions. Everyone is spellbound. George.
Well, there are three things in the last couple of hours.
Please tell everybody who you are and how you're here. I know, but the rest don't know you.
I'm George Fisher. I publish books. Paris, where we sit, is right on top of a bigger shale deposit than Pennsylvania. You haven't mentioned that. We heard the earlier session, which didn't mention taxes, didn't mention regulatory interference. Do you need us to tell you this?
I mentioned regulation.
Correct.
Okay. I didn't mention shale, but I don't think, I mean, that's not the only way in which an economy can expand. In fact, right now, I'm not sure it would be the right time to go into shale. At 60, below $60 a barrel, why would you want to be doing shale in Europe right now? And, with regard to taxes, that's part of structural reforms. Absolutely part of structural reforms.
David? In the back. I can't see you.
Jim Kelly, Kelly Capital. The question about shale, the question about oil brings up a chart that Deborah had in the last go-round of 100 billion euros to be invested in energy, among other things. And I wonder, given Europe's vulnerability to Russia and Mr. Putin's penchant for wanting to expand, what's going on in the Ukraine, how he's jiggling his sword now again in Georgia, is Lithuania going to be next? What do you see is the reaction on the part of anyone over here about getting ready to become energy independent, if you have to, from Russia?
So completing the single market in Europe, in energy, in telecoms, and in transportation are key elements of the Juncker plan. And those are the areas where some regulatory harmonization would serve as a far more important impetus to private investment than even that little catalytic 100 billion. It's a big number, but it's actually a small number compared to kind of what's needed. So the harmonization aspect of these regulations is really the key stumbling block. And I think we could get private investment interested right away with regulatory harmonization. It's hard for governments to do that. It's hard to really complete the single market here in Europe. But that's where I go back to, if we could get Juncker to be a vocabulary word that governments collectively can embrace, then that at least is a step forward to talking about what that means in terms of the actual regulations and taking on some domestic vested self-interests as well.
Well, for those of us Americans who are spending dollars over here, Paris looks a lot more attractive. I'm wondering to what extent the foreign exchange adjustment since mid-September is a significant compensatory policy, if you will, instrument. Is it helping, or is the risk involved in the volatility of the exchange rate move a danger?
So, are you talking about risk and danger from the standpoint of the United States, or because the appreciation of the euro is definitely a shot in the arm for the euro area, even though internally the trade intensity of Europe with other European economies is very high. Still, at the margin, it's definitely helpful. It builds on four of the economies at the periphery that kind of did a lot of structural reforms earlier on and had to promote their exports as a way of closing their external imbalances. I'm thinking Portugal and Spain and Ireland in particular. Those economies are 2 or 3 years ahead in terms of their businesses finding new markets. And the new markets are principally in places where the euro has depreciated against. So those economies are already doing well on the export side. I think the tourism issue is going to be huge in terms of seeing the summer tourism in Europe. In terms of volatility, the countries that are going to have problems with volatility are not the European economies. They are the emerging markets. They're the ones who borrowed in dollars and are going to reap a significant problem with the appreciation of the dollar. But even if it was a steady, they could perhaps handle if there was some steady movement. But simply the ups and the downs, the sloshing in and out of the amount of capital that's available, it's definitely going to pose problems to the emerging markets. The one thing about Europe that I think, going back to Europe for a minute, I think one of the things that is going to cause some tensions is that the German current account surplus is going to widen even further. And there's definitely going to be some grumblings about that.
I've gotten a signal that the two folks that I signaled and said, we'll get your questions in, has been redirected to the next panel. Thank you very much, Kathy.